Good evening. I'm Dr. Luis Daniel Munoz. You are joining us here on Pump Up the Volume, where we're amplifying the voices of communities and really trying to share insights into movements that are happening on the ground and throughout the state of Rhode Island. My fellow co-host today, as always, you have Mr. Scott Rotunda from WBOB 990 joining us again, and also Mr. Pat Ford, founder of the Coalition Radio Network that we're actually streaming through and co-founder of the Libertarian Party in the state of Rhode Island. As you know, we tend to spend many of our weeks debating contentious issues, but today we're not going to do that. Today we're actually going to, we've had the opportunity, I would say, and the privilege of having an honored guest, Marcela Betancourt, the Executive Director of Latino Policy Institute here in the state of Rhode Island. And there was an interesting poll released, which the Providence Journal and the Boston Globe actually published articles on, that highlighted that 63% of Latino parents in Providence support charter schools. And given where we are with the significant equity gaps in education and this threatened moratorium on the charter school expansion here in the state of Rhode Island, it is an important time to have this discussion. So what I was hoping is, while I've provided a framework in terms of what we're likely going to talk about, maybe we can actually learn more about Marcela, and as well as the Latino Policy Institute, and just the nature of the work that you do on a day-to-day. It would be great.
Thank you so much, Doctor. I appreciate it. Thank you, Pat, and everyone else for having me here today. So as Dr. Munoz said, my name is Marcela Betancourt, and I've been at the Latino Policy Institute for 2 years. But LPI has been around for 15 years, actually. We are part of Roger Williams University, and so we are an organization within the university, and we are really proud of the work that we do. Our work mainly focuses on stimulating public policy to examine and communicate the evolving experience of Latinos. And so I say the evolving experience of Latinos because one of the things that's really important to us as an organization is to share that not all Latinos look the same. We're not a monolithic community. There are different generations. We look different. We have different languages. We have different backgrounds, and so it's an important part of the work that we do to ensure that whatever we do, we keep that intersection in mind. And so we do a lot of this work through research, education, advocacy, and community engagement. And I'm really proud of the work that we do. And so, as you mentioned, yesterday we released a recent poll that we did. So it focused on Latino parents in the city of Providence. And the reason why the poll came out, so it had a lot more questions than the Justice Charter School. Obviously, for reasons that you mentioned, the charter school response has really been the headline everywhere. I'm happy to talk about that, but there are a lot of other questions and issues that we tackled in the poll regarding how parents are feeling about their experiences and barriers or skills that, with COVID-19 in their communities, with virtual learning, with the takeover, and even in other really important issues such as, their access to technology, their access to food in general. So I'm happy to chat a little bit about that too. So if you want me to go on, I don't
want to make it an awkward. Sorry, I don't want to make it an awkward space. No, I mean, absolutely, we'd love to. I think what's important is I know that the mainstream media wants to capitalize on things that are currently being debated and on the legislative bodies, and I understand the need for that to create attention. But I'd love to just really get some perspective on why the Latino Policy Institute went about asking the specific questions that it asked. What is it that it kind of lit that fire, as they say, and then ultimately, what can we do with the information that in terms of actionable steps to support the community?
Thank you. Yes. So thank you for asking that. So the reason why the poll came about, during COVID-19, and even prior to that, we, as an organization, we kept hearing of, parents and students are being impacted in this, and this way. And this is what us, and by us, I can mean, RIDE or other entities or X or Y people. This is what should happen. But so many times there was a voice lacking, and it was the communities that were being directly impacted. So I appreciate when you mentioned that of giving the voice to community members. In the city of Providence, as were in other cities like Central Falls and Pawtucket and other cities, Latinos were disproportionately impacted by COVID-19. And as we know, COVID-19 didn't just impact our health, it impacted like us economically, socially, and in more ways than one that we'll probably just continue to see in the next decade. So when we came up with the questions, one of the things that I wanted to know, and this was especially, the questions came up in January, December, January. And it was when we were talking about, well, we have to go back to school, full on, everyone. And I kept pushing that that's okay, and for the people that need it, but are we asking if parents feel safe? Are we asking if parents have been communicated well of what is needed and how they're feeling about this? And I think that that's what led to part of the questions. The charter school question, charter schools have been a contentious subject for many, many years. And so this is something that we took advantage of, being able to pose this, the poll to Providence parents to ask that question. The question was, what's your favorability? Like, what are your favorability towards charter schools? And do you, and I'm happy to read the question word by word, but it was also like, we asked about the expansion. Do you think charter schools should be expanded in your district? We also asked follow-up questions regarding how do you think that an expansion of charter schools would impact funding to traditional public schools? And the answers to that were the most interesting one. And I'd love to talk about that further. But we wanted to make sure that we were looking at holistically what we kept hearing outside people talk, like say that parents needed or students needed. And what we found is that Latino Providence parents are still worried about COVID. They're incredibly worried about what it's doing in their community. They're incredibly, they're very divided among, do they believe that students should go to school completely in person, or should it be completely virtually, or should it be hybrid? And so that answer was important. Something to keep in mind, a lot of the parents that were talking, that demonstrated that virtual learning wasn't working for their students, a lot of them didn't have access to reliable internet. So one of the things that we have been, all of us maybe in this, in this conversation, at one point or another, maybe our Wi-Fi wasn't great, but some of us are not going to school for 8 hours a day, right? And if I have to call out of work because my Wi-Fi went down, that's different than being in school and our parents and, et cetera. And so this is something that's impacting parents. 45% of parents who responded had issues affording food during the pandemic. So now we have parents who can't afford food or are having issues with it, with 12% of those parents who do not have reliable internet. And so this accumulates to just having a really difficult time having the basics for virtual learning. And so that, to me, that's actually one of the most important things that we need to take away. The Providence School District takeover was another question that I wanted to pose there, because the Latino Policy Institute and several other organizations, we've questioned what happened during the takeover, and then how do we make it community and student centered the whole time? And I think that, there's been work around it, but this was an important question for parents, right? Because the district talks about it, teachers talk about it, some students talk about it, community organizations, we talk about it, but what are parents saying and hearing and feeling about it? And that demonstrated, the poll demonstrated, most parents don't think that there's been any changes for positive or negative. Some parents seem to really not know anything about what the turnaround, what the takeover did. And so that's a concerning. And so what I'm hoping to do with some of these results, specifically, for example, the answers that we gathered around how parents feel regarding in-person learning, virtual learning, hybrid learning, communication with the schools, is to have those conversations with the school district, to have those conversations with the RIDE and say, well, how are we engaging parents in these conversations? Because while we are going, we're doing we're making some strides with vaccination. The impacts of COVID-19 may not stop there. And it will be important that we have these discussions. How are we engaging parents in what the takeover does? What has moved and what hasn't? How are we engaging parents in what charter schools are and what it means, what funding does and doesn't do, right? Because I think the responses that we found about that really speaks about parents want an expansion, either because they have applied to them or because they have a large favorability for charter schools, but there's still that misunderstanding and misconceptions or just interesting thoughts of what happens with funding or just not knowing at all what happens with funding. So I think that's some of the conversations that we want to have. And part of those conversations, we will be having them specifically with parents to continue following up. And because the poll demonstrated we keep having conversations in a vacuum and we're not engaging them at all.
No, thank you so much for the work and I'm going to frame it in this way because I think it's appropriate in this case, having the courage to ask the questions, right? Because I mean, too often, we're not even putting those questions in a public setting or in a forum where legislators and leaders have to pay attention or, have to be held accountable to what the answers are. I'm wondering about the next stage of this. And so, when I think of community broadband, and I think of just opportunities of addressing technology access issues associated with distance learning, which could in part become somewhat of a new norm if we think about extending school days in some shape or form. When I think about that, I think, well, municipal leadership, even in a state takeover, what role does a mayor have and whether the community is actually thinking about that, or is that maybe the next step of this, of the questions that will be framed by the Latino Policy Institute? And then in addition to that, in terms of next steps, education formula, right, in Rhode Island. I mean, it's antiquated. I mean, it just doesn't make sense that we're fixing it on a percentage rate of property value, right? When we have cities that, as a result of that, are getting aid and they have just a general surplus of revenue and are able to build beautiful new schools while Providence struggles. Is that also the next step? I guess I'm wondering whether there's an education component to this engagement that you've started.
Yeah, I think absolutely yes to all of that. I think I really appreciate your thought, your thought and your question of, well, so does this mean that maybe we pose it onto municipalities to expand broadband internet? Because I'm sure that Providence is not the only municipality that is struggling with internet. I actually, when I saw the results, I remember when we were doing census work in the state and receiving numbers that about 17 to 18% of the state of Rhode Island individuals do not have access to internet. So I mean, that's a big percentage. That is a large percentage. And a few months later, the pandemic hit us. So I think that is an incredible investment, right? Municipalities in the state actually are receiving a lot of money for investments in the future, right? That it will impact the things that we have seen. I think that access to the internet is an incredible thing. It is something that I myself, right? I have gone to doctor appointments throughout the pandemic. I have gone to my parents have been able to go to therapy and other things through, virtual internet. This is the only way I was able to connect with family for many months. And I've been able to go to work. And so I do think it's an important investment. And it tells us a lot more, because I think one of the other things that happened with virtual learning and this hybrid model that I think we need to explore a little bit more is the accessibility that we are providing families, students, and teachers themselves. I think a hybrid model can be interesting. And when the pandemic started, so many of us were like, well, maybe this is our opportunity to think through again what things could look like. But we seem to be going back, right? We're also comfortable in just saying well, let's just go back to what it looked like. I think we can't. There are things that weren't working. People died. People lost their job. People lost their entire livelihood because of a pandemic, of how things were working. We can't go back to that. And so I think that investing in thinking bigger is important. thinking through how we are educating and providing access and support to our students and our families. Again, the support part is something that we can't forget, because the regular curriculum is important, but the support that we have to provide is also really important. And going back to just the food access, that was crushing to see. Parents who weren't able to work from home, so I'm sure that they were struggling with their students, is a really important thing. And so, yes, to answer your question, I think it is an education thing. The education formula itself is this terrible thing that we have somehow just kept pushing. Like, what's the saying? Like, it's like you keep kicking the can down the road. Is that the saying? My like Spanish doesn't let me know how like what the sayings are all the time. But I think that's the thing, and we can't have to stop doing that, because we can go more decades with kids all over our state, just because of where they were born or because of where they live. They get to have schools that are crumbling. They get to have, I don't get to have a laptop that works because I grew up in Central Falls, right? And so I think that's something we have to think through. When we educate every single student at the best capacity that we can, every person in this state wins, right? It's an investment. Education is an investment. So many of I went to college because that's what I was told. Your education is an investment. Yet we're not willing to invest into generations. And so I think it's a really important thing that we have to have a conversation of, and we have to push the General Assembly to do this, to be brave. You mentioned being brave and courageous to ask questions. We have to push a General Assembly and our municipal leaders to be brave to push this. We can't expect Black and Brown people to be the ones that push for a new funding formula. I want people in also really affluent communities like Coventry and East Greenwich to push on this as well, because it's an investment in their communities as well.
Absolutely. I wonder whether, did you consider when you were creating this particular poll, and I know this is maybe too much of like the healthcare side of things, but growing up in CF as well, measuring hopelessness or a sense of disenfranchisement, like do parents feel that they have the power to create the change? And it's always an interesting question that I ask myself, because I know that I don't really think of my mother ever really felt like she had the power to influence the system until she graduated from college, when I graduated, and until she kind of was empowered with like, well, now I'm somehow a part of it, therefore I can influence it. But I don't think everyone has that luxury. And so I guess do you have a question that you extrapolated that from, or was it even in like on the kind of list of questions to ask about that like disenfranchisement measure? I don't know how else to frame it.
No, that's a really good point. And we did not, that's not something that we asked directly, but I think so in a very interesting way, earlier this year, in the last couple of months, the Latino Policy Institute, along with two other organizations, one of which is a parent organization called Parents Leading for Educational Equity, and another organization that pushes for multilingual learning. We did several forums with parents, right, to kind of inform parents about your rights, as a parent around multilingual learning, and how to advocate, and these are the legal terms. And I can't tell you how many parents came into those forums and said, like, well, I just feel like I can't do this. Like, I feel like I'm a burden if I go to the school and complain, or if I go to complain, no one listens and nothing gets done. So I think it's that, while the poll didn't show that, we did have plenty of parents in other settings telling us the same thing. And these are Latino parents too, parents who are, English is probably their only language, which is one of the many reasons why there are barriers. Yet it doesn't mean that they should be less afforded the privilege of being able to have these conversations and access to school officials. So it is something that I think is really important, and that we see time and time again. So you talk about your mom. My mom was, when I went to high school, my mom was undocumented at the time, and she believed that going to school and complaining or saying something was going to get her in trouble. And like, she would respect to a school, even though they were failing in many ways. And so I think that while that would have been a great question for this poll, and then to dig even more, truth is that we can see that the reality of what that is in just how parents contextualize, or actually, and even just look at the answers regarding the takeover. The takeover happened 1.5 years ago, and parents do not know if there have been any changes. They don't think that there have been any changes, right? So that's what we found. What does that say to us? There has not been enough communication and direct connection with, hey, like Dr. Luis Munoz, this is what happened during the turnover. This is what we did. This is what changed with your student. These are the things that we're going to do in the next 2 years. Parents don't know that, and that's that's on the district, and that's something that we have to look at. Maybe that's us as organizations as well. Like, have we not reached out enough to parents to say this is what can be done? So I think a lot of that would probably answer those questions.
Awesome. Wondering as well, and Scott and Pat, if you have a question, I'll hog one last question. So I apologize.
Yeah, I do, but you go ahead, Doctor.
Yeah, just a quick question. Just the broader applicability of the work that the Latino Policy Institute does, and I guess what I mean by that is, we have Cape Verdean community in Pawtucket that, in many ways, if we struggle, they struggle. And just wondering if there's a level of collaboration between the Latino Policy Institute and other organizations like CVH, especially when it comes to the actionable steps that follow, this type of data set.
Yeah, thank you for asking that. Yes, it is something that, while I have been there, it's something that I've been very thoughtful and conscious of, because while our name, says Latino Policy Institute, as you said, the work that we do to impact Latinos, truth is that it's there to impact everyone, because while we may be 16% of the population, we were not 16 before when we were created. And I truthfully believe that when you want to improve a community, you have to, we are here as Latinos, thanks to the work that our Indigenous community, our Black community has done before us, the opportunities that they have fought for and taken. And we're here thanks to them. And every little change that we do to improve how systems work for communities who have been historically underserved will work with others. I think it's a work in progress. It's something that we have not perfected, not just at the Latino Policy Institute, but at other organizations, but it's something that it's important to learn about. I think it's important to elevate all the time our Asian American communities, our Indigenous communities, our Black communities, and learn from them, right? And as I said earlier, and the Latino community is an evolving a community. And so we also have to learn from them. One of the things that I worry about most is what happens 10 years from now. Other communities might come, and I want to make sure that our Latino community is open and welcoming and thoughtful of how we have to help them as well, always the same way that other communities have helped us get here.
I wanted to jump in with a question, and if I can echo the doctor's and Scott's thoughts, I'd like to say, first of all, thank you for joining us tonight. This is a very, very important conversation, and I hope, particularly as the Institute continues, as they have for a number of years, develop important thoughts, reflections, studies, issues, white papers, whatever. You'll continue to consider this a place that you can come and share, I think, in a conversational format, exactly what you folks are working on. But you touched on the immigration status issue. On a personal level, I'm an open borders person. I really don't believe in borders per se. Your mom's, I don't want to use the word fear because it sounds she didn't have a lot of fears, but her concerns is probably
fear is a good word.
Her fears and concerns about being exposed. How often does that impact across the board, whether it be COVID-related issues, distance learning, any one of the number of topics you talked about, plus any other issue, particular, post-high school education opportunities? How much does the fear of exposure and/or issues surrounding immigration status often limit parental involvement in the school life of their children?
It's a great question, and thank you for asking that. I think it affects it greatly. And so I'll speak in my experience and, what my mom went through. And it's interesting because I asked her a very interesting question of like what she would do if I were a young person today. Truth is that a person's immigration status or lack thereof does not only impact that individual, but it impacts their family and their community. As I mentioned, while my mom was undocumented, my mom was a single mom who worked at a factory, earning less than minimum wage, and I was an American citizen. And so I understood the impacts of that and how privileged I was. I understood my privilege at 12 years old. And the fear of at that time when I was younger, driver's license individuals without legal status had driver's licenses legally in our state. And so she was able to drive, but she was always still really scared. And that impacts your mental health in ways that you can't imagine. Today, during COVID-19, we have seen people who are undocumented that continued working even when they were sick because they're not afforded the access to, to get unemployment benefits, even though they pay into unemployment because they pay taxes and they pay all these things, right?
Right.
And so that's just troublesome. They didn't get, the stimulus that we all might have gotten. It was harder for them to. It was harder for them to just do so many other things. See, for a portion of time to seek medical service, and so I think that when it comes just having to go to work, that like life has to continue, even though there is a global pandemic that is killing people that look like you. That's impactful to just your family. When it comes to virtual learning, just advocating for yourself in school, I think, again, I'll speak from my experience. For my mom, it was this thing of, I don't speak the language, so I have to look for someone who will speak, who will speak for me. And sometimes that was Marcella. Sometimes that was another parent. That's difficult. So there's yet another barrier. There's also that respect factor and that fear factor of, well, I'm just this immigrant woman why will this white person care about what I have to say? How do I question the education system in this country when I only understand the one back home, right? When my daughter back home had a great education, yet here I don't understand what's happening. And so I think there are so many barriers, and I think fear is sadly, it's a real word. I think discomfort, and I think, I even as while I spoke the language and I did everything else, I did feel, I could tell how teachers treated my mom differently because she didn't speak the language. They dismissed her during parent-teacher conferences a lot faster than they dismissed people who could speak the language. And that's troublesome, and I think that's really difficult. And so if that was many years ago when I was in high school, I'm sure that during this new world where parents had to navigate virtual learning, when they themselves might not have had the access or knowledge to know how to do it. Or to understand how to advocate for their students at the time. That's just one barrier in front of another.
It just strikes me that at this point in time in the year 2021, we should be looking to create safe harbors within the educational system for parents who are here. I'll just say euphemistically with paperwork issues. How about that? Folks who might be here for different reasons, because ultimately, let's forget about the individual impact for just a moment. It just strikes me that societally, we are all better off if children who are going to be here, whether they be dreamers or new dreamers or just ordinary folks, if they get that quality education, that's obviously that next step in the, I guess, what we call the ascension to the middle class. And the fact that so many folks from the different communities in the state have been able to do that despite all these obligations proves just, again, on another level, the value that folks from these communities offer to the state as a whole, economically, socially, culturally, and quite frankly, philosophically. So I think that conversation needs to take place at some level.
Thank you. Thank you for saying that. I don't have anything to add because I appreciate that very much. But absolutely, this country was built by Native, on the back of Native Americans, Black people, and immigrants. And so, and now we're just questioning why they can't speak a different language. So yes, thank you for saying that.
Well, I just, just to kind of wrap up my thoughts for tonight, the accident of one's birth, whether it be anywhere in this world, should not or ever be considered an obstacle to one's personal liberty, and as a result, one's personal realization of their potential. It just these are borders and, if you will, barriers that were placed by people hundreds, thousands of years ago that bear no relevance whatsoever to real world as we know it. And the notion that someone born in one part of a continent is given different opportunities in the world than someone else born in a different part of the continent, quite honestly, is ludicrous. And it's just time to move beyond that. And on that, I will be unusually brief, Marcella, because that is brief for me, and I will cede the floor back to the good doctor.
Yeah, that is brief. Maybe Scott and I can attest to that. Scott, I know we're at time, but I want to acknowledge that you've been with us this whole time. I've seen the physical cues. I think Marcella has captured that too, so we can see the agreement when it's been reflected out. Marcella, I want to thank you so much for joining us. It's clear that the systemic inequities, which are ultimately founded on a system of systemic racism, needs to be first acknowledged and then just practically addressed. And the data that you've been able to compile from parents is a way to inform the changes and the actions that we can take. So my hope for everyone listening is that, we'll all do our part in taking a step in that direction, whether it's pushing government officials or ourselves, coming together as a community and really talking about what some of the proposed solutions can be. I also just want to acknowledge some of the other things you mentioned. This crisis has, I would say, lifted up the call to be human, right? And to acknowledge what the fundamental human rights are as it relates to healthcare, as it relates to education, as it relates to just the opportunity to live and to thrive, especially in a country as wealthy as ours. So with that, I do want to lift up one event that's taking place April 10th and 11th. It will be a mass vaccination weekend for Black, Indigenous, Hispanic, Latino, and Asian communities. And the intention with that is to address the equity gap in vaccine allocations. It's something that we called for last week, that myself and other community leaders, and even those that could not stand with us, have been calling for it for some time. So in solidarity, we're moving forward. Would appreciate anyone who's willing to help that day on the operation side to please reach out by email, volume in the comment sections, however you can, and we will have a place for you. So again, the goal is to vaccinate over 6,000 people that weekend and likely have another vaccination weekend 2 weeks later. And this is a step that, in combination with improving our education system, will help save lives. So just wanted to lift that up. And Marcella, thank you again so much. We hope to have you back, whenever you'd like, as well as looking forward to the many things that you'll build on from this.
I would love to. Thank you so much, all of you, for making space today. This is great. This was really fun. And so have a wonderful night. And thank you for the work that all of you are doing and for uplifting the great vaccine work. That's amazing. I hope you get 6,000 people. That's awesome. That's really great to hear. Thank you again, everybody, for making time for us today.
Thank you. Have a great evening, everyone.
Good night, everyone.
See us next week on Pump Up the Volume.